Today I will be talking about the land use value scale I created to help conserve the Great Plains. I am Lily Swikert, and the information I am presenting is part of my dissertation research in the Department of Natural Resource Management at South Dakota State University. My co-author is Larry Gelati. I first gave this presentation at the International Symposium on Society and Resource Management in Houghton, Michigan on June 25, 2016. This research is a cooperative effort, and I want to take a moment to acknowledge our contributors. South Dakota State University, the Department of Natural Resource Management, and the South Dakota Cooperative Research Unit, the state agencies of Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota, Iowa, and Montana, and of course, the Plains and Prairie Potholes Landscape Conservation Cooperative. Before I get started, let me give you a roadmap so you have an idea for where we'll be going today. I'll first give you the human context, then talk about the grassland ecosystem and conservation efforts. I'll give you a brief overview of my research and then move on to the land use value scale I developed. We live in a time of great natural resource management challenges. The United Nations produced this graph in 2014 to show the projected human population by 2050 at low, medium, and high fertility rates. As human population increases, we will see an increased demand for natural resources such as water. We will also see an increased demand for arable land. This figure shows how the amount of arable land per person decreased by more than 50% from 1965 to 2005. Grasslands are the ecosystem that provide the majority of food for humanity. In North America, our grasslands are primarily located in the middle of the continent and are known as the Great Plains. When Europeans first settled the Midwest, the native habitat of the Great Plains covered 2 to 3 million kilometers squared. Today, farmers and ranchers use the plains either for pasture for beef cattle or convert native grassland habitat to row crops such as wheat, corn, and soybeans. Grasslands also provide many indirect benefits to humans in the form of ecosystem services, such as providing clean water and helping to stem climate change through carbon sequestration. The grassland ecosystem is a complex assemblage of organisms. Each organism fills an ecological niche that dictates how the ecosystem functions. Another benefit we derive from the Great Plains is native flora and fauna. Before European settlement, the plains rivaled the African Serengeti in terms of wildlife, teeming with huge herds of bison, massive prairie dog colonies, and impressive flocks of waterfowl. In fact, the prairie pothole region in the northeast portion of the plains is considered the nation's duck factory. But grasslands are one of the most endangered ecosystems on the planet, and the Great Plains are no exception. We have lost over 50% of the native habitat in the Great Plains. With that loss of habitat comes a decline in wildlife species, such as the black-tailed prairie dog and grassland and wetland birds. The loss of native habitat and wildlife species results in a loss of biodiversity, which could jeopardize the functions of the ecosystem, making it less resilient to environmental events such as disease, drought, and fire. This puts us in a catch-22, because by collecting our grassland benefits, we could actually be jeopardizing their very existence. More recently, increases in commodity prices have resulted in an alarming increased rate of conversion of native habitat to row crops, with some landowners developing even marginally productive land. Studies have revealed increased conversion rates of 1 to 5% annually. These rates are similar to those from the 1920s that preceded the Dust Bowl. Looking into the future, we can predict that as technology continues to improve, farmers and ranchers will find fewer and fewer obstacles to expanding their operations and potentially jeopardizing the stability of the ecosystem even further. So conservationists are trying to figure out what to do. They know that a solid understanding of the biology and ecology of the ecosystem provides the foundation for conservation, but they have come to realize that they won't be successful in their efforts without a deep understanding of the people involved. The conservationist dream is to help create a working landscape like this, where farmers and ranchers are able to use the land to produce food, and the native habitat is also protected. This is a photo of some land enrolled in the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program in Iowa. You can see the farmers' row crops in the bottom right corner, and the restored wetland and riparian area in the background. The Plains and Prairie Potholes Landscape Conservation Cooperative is funding my dissertation research investigating the human dimensions of habitat loss in the ecoregion. This map shows how the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service defines ecoregion. For my dissertation, I am working with the state agencies of Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, and Iowa to survey private landowners in each of their states. When developing the questionnaires, we realized we needed a tool to help understand the different land use values landowners have for their land. The Land Use Value Scale is a collection of statements that represent underlying values landowners have for their land related to natural resources. The point of the scale is to give conservationists the tool they need to start productive conversations with landowners about conserving natural resources. I like to think about it as the love scale, because if you love grasslands, you have to love your landowners. I'm going to give you a brief description of my scale development methods. From a literature review, I chose some relevant statements from the Land Ethics Scale developed at the University of Minnesota and the Human and Nature Scale from the Netherlands, in addition to creating 40 items of my own. There were 50 items in total. We tested the items on over 1,000 people and analyze the results with factor analysis. The final scale has 13 items and measures 2 dimensions, human-centered values and nature-centered values. These are the statements on the final scale. When we sent the scale out to landowners, we put the statements in random order and asked them to rank their level of agreement or disagreement for each statement on a scale of 1 to 7. We then calculated their average score for each dimension and combined the 2 scores to find out their land use value type. The names for the land use value types are still a work in progress, and if you have any suggestions, I'd love to hear them. But for now, if a person disagreed with the human-centered and nature-centered statements, I'm calling them disconnected. If a person agreed with the human-centered and nature-centered statements, I'm calling them eco-social. If a person agreed with the human-centered but not with the nature-centered statements, I'm calling them humanistic. And if a person agreed with the nature-centered but not with the human-centered statements, I'm calling them naturistic. This exact scale went out to the landowners in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota. The states of Montana and Iowa made some changes to it. We're still in the process of collecting data. The only full data set we had at the time of this presentation was South Dakota's. So, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm only going to focus on South Dakota. We had a sample size of 942 and an adjusted response rate of 31%. Before I dive into my results, I'm going to give you a little bit of background information on South Dakota. 89% of the land is used for farming, which includes ranching, and only 11% is used for things like housing and roads. And 84% of the land is owned by private individuals and families. Now moving on to the land use value scale. These are my research questions. The first thing I wanted to know was, can the land use value scale actually differentiate between landowners in a meaningful way? We asked landowners to rate the importance of 12 categories of fauna to the decisions they make about land use on a scale of 1 to 4, 1 being not important and 4 being very important. We then added up their rankings to get an overall wildlife importance score. People with a high score marked most fauna categories on the importance side. If my scale worked, I expected that people with a naturistic land use value type would say more kinds of wildlife were important to their decisions than people with a humanistic land use value type. And that is exactly what I found. These results show that people who have naturistic land use value types think more kinds of wildlife are important to their land use decisions than any of the other land use value types. And people with a humanistic land use value give the lowest importance to wildlife when making decisions about the land. The results are quite significant. Now that we know that the land use value scale works to differentiate the values landowners have for their land, I wanted to see if I could use the scale to understand landowners' land use practices. We asked landowners about specific land use practices like establishing or restoring a wetland or planting pollinator seeds. we look to see the relationships between doing each practice and that person's land use value type. For the extremes, we expected to find people with a naturistic land use value type to participate in more conservation-friendly behaviors than those with a humanistic land use value type. Again, that is exactly what we found. You can see that people with naturistic land use values were significantly more likely to participate in conservation-friendly land use practices than people with humanistic land use values. The pattern repeats itself for every practice. Now moving on to my final research question. The reason for creating this scale was to give conservationists the information they need to have a productive conversation with landowners about natural resource conservation. You can certainly talk about what people do, but you're gonna have a much better conversation if you can talk about why they do those things. We gave landowners a bunch of reasons why they might choose the land use practices they use and asked them to rate the importance of each reason on the same 1 to 4 scale as before, 1 being not important and 4 being very important. We then looked for relationships between their responses and their land use value type. Our expectations remain the same. Landowners who hold naturistic or eco-social land use values with high nature-centered scores would be more likely to place more importance on conservation-friendly reasons for their practices than those with humanistic and disconnected land use values. And this is what we found. The land use value scale significantly and consistently found people with naturistic and eco-social land use value types gave more importance to conservation-related reasons than those with humanistic and disconnected land use value types. In conclusion, the land use value scale can be used to help improve conservationists' understanding of landowners' underlying land use values. By learning more about the landowners themselves, conservationists can use the information gained through the land use value scale to improve messaging of conservation programs and be more efficient in their efforts of recruiting conservation program participants in order to improve conservation outcomes in the Great Plains. Because love for landowners translates into love for grasslands. If you have any questions or suggestions for the land use value scale, I'd be more than happy to hear them. Please contact me at the email address provided. Thank you for your interest.